So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much, Ursula, for the very generous introduction. Thank you to the UIL for bringing us all together to celebrate the work of the UIL, the amazing work of the UIL, but also 33 years of Ukraine's independence. Thank you all for coming to share that celebration with us. And I'm really, really delighted to be able to talk to one of, I'm a Ukrainian literature specialist, and there are fewer, more important and more interesting, more influential Ukrainian writers alive today than Andriy Kurkov. So it's a great thrill for me to speak to you today. I want to talk to you about the books in a second, but I want to ask you a question about Ukrainian independence. So the reason we're here today, to celebrate the 33 years of renewed independence, of course. What does today mean to you personally?
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. And probably I should mention that this place has something to do with my family, because my wife, after the university, worked here. My wife is from Sari, but she's in Kyiv now, and she's in Kyiv since 1988 with me. And yeah, I mean, Independence Day, now it's a very special day because we understand that actually independence of Ukraine means freedom to every citizen of Ukraine. And for Ukrainians, freedom was always more important than stability. For Russians, stability was always more important than freedom. That's why they gave up their freedoms and they ended up where they ended up. And we are still fighting for our freedom. And actually, this is a tradition in Ukraine from 15th century to fight for the freedom. And actually, if you want to be free for a long time, you have to have your state behind you. You have to be a member of the community which is capable of defending the borders, the territories, and the territories of your freedom, because this is Ukrainian territory for us.
I mean, I guess that question of freedom, the attitude towards freedom is something that is very characteristic of Ukrainians. I think it's something that's very important in Ukrainian culture, and like you say, maybe there's a contrast there with culture in Russia. Certainly one of the important aspects of freedom is freedom of speech, freedom to speak and write as we want. That's not something that exists in Russia, it's something that exists in Ukraine and is very fiercely protected by Ukrainians, by Ukrainian writers, by organizations like PEN Ukraine, which you are the president of. We're the president of.
Yes.
And I wonder this, I also thinking about the last 3 decades of Ukrainian independence, how has it been? I also know that your writing career basically more or less coincides with that period, since you came to prominence as a writer in the early 90s. So you're kind of a writer of Ukrainian independence, I would say. How is
Well, probably I mean, you know, I was trying to become a Soviet writer because I couldn't imagine that the Soviet Union will disappear. And I failed because I was told many times by Ukrainian Soviet and Russian Soviet editors that I don't write Soviet literature. So I mean,
a great compliment.
Yeah, well, and then when the 1991 happened, when the Soviet Union collapsed, I was extremely happy and at the same time very sad because I started writing fiction from jokes, because I have a brother who was a dissident in the Soviet time and his friends were telling political jokes always. And I loved this genre. And actually, although I started as a poet at the age of 7 years old, at 13 I was already writing jokes about Brezhnev. And I was looking for some absurdity, because there was lots of absurdity in the Soviet life. So in 1991 I thought, well, now the Soviet Union is gone, no absurdity, no inspiration, but freedom. But then I realized that actually you can have freedom and absurdity for the price of one. And I mean, there was enough inspiration since then. And I have a feeling that I lived in 5 different Ukraines from 1991. And each new Ukraine was better than the previous until 2014. Actually, yeah, because even 2010, I had a feeling that we can deal with Yanukovych, we can actually force him out, we can force him to change.
And how have things changed for you as a writer over that time? in terms of how you feel as a writer, your relationship with publishers, with readers, with the culture of reading in Ukraine? How has it changed?
Oh, it changed many times, up and down, but I'm extremely happy to have here in the audience my first British publisher, Christopher McLehouse, who is a legend in English-speaking world. And if you don't mind, let's give him an applause. And I should tell you the secret, actually, that he forced me to write both diaries about Ukrainian war. Well, I mean, not forced, but I mean, he said that you should write and we will publish it. And now he's actually pushing me to write the third book about life during the war in Ukraine, and I hope it will be the last one, and the victory will be included in this book. Yeah. But if we talk about Ukrainian readers, I mean, when I was much younger, for almost 20 years, I was touring Ukraine with my books in the bags together with Kokatyuha, with brothers Kapranovs, and it was a wonderful time. I mean, we would come to a village in Odessa region where nobody came since 1991. And actually, people who came to the event, I mean, they were listening to us, and they didn't believe that they see strangers on their territory. And then they would buy books, and then they actually would come to Odessa when there was a festival and we were invited. So, I mean, this kind of connections were growing and growing and growing, and then we had a couple of times crisis in the economy, which turned into crisis in publishing industry, and then the sales went down and there was less interest because there was hardships and people were thinking about something else. And now we have another rise, very specific, because now people are buying books as a sign of resistance, as the effort to protect Ukrainian culture. So I mean, this 12 or 13 bookshops, new bookshops in Kyiv last year. I mean, for me, it is a miracle, a puzzle, and a hope that actually people are setting up new bookshops, new publishing houses, that the young generation is actually buying books and reading books. And of course, I mean, what we have now, people are reading mostly nonfiction, the new Ukrainian classics, so I mean, the executed generation authors are in demand. The poetry is in demand, but I noticed that we have more and more translated literature, which is a good thing and a bad sign. It means that Ukrainian writers are writing less now. Fiction is not written during the war. And I know how it is difficult to read fiction in the war, because to write and to read you need concentration. You should be able to distract yourself from the reality. Reality of the war actually demands you to check the news, to check where the Russian missiles are flying now. And this is very tense time for everybody. And I regret that many Ukrainian writers now stopped writing fiction. Of course, I mean, more than 40 of them are soldiers on the front. And altogether, actually, we lost about 100 people who were writers, poets, translators, publishers. One of the first victims of the war was translator from ancient Greek language, Alexander Kisluk, professor of pedagogical Dragomanov University. And I mean, we have now the very long list of Ukrainian people of culture who became victims of this war.
In this situation, I mean, it brings a certain responsibility to the writer, I guess. In the situation where the culture is under threat, writers are very under real physical threat. How do you feel dealing with that responsibility, with that burden of being a Ukrainian writer in the wartime?
Well, I don't think actually writers are dealing with this burden. I mean, they do what they can. I mean, many writers are now busy as volunteers. I mean, I should mention Andriy Kurkov from Uzhgorod, Transcarpathian region, who bought in the 2.5 years of the full-scale invasion, he raised money and bought 302 four-wheel drive cars for the front, and he drove with his friends all these cars to Donbas region, to Zaporizhia, etc. So, I mean, if you think about the burden, you cannot act. You suffer or you are in doubt. Nobody is in doubt in Ukraine. Everybody knows what is happening. Everybody knows what he or she can do.
I wanted to bring us back to this question of fiction versus non-fiction, which you mentioned, because you have two books, two new books in translation at the moment. One is about the war, it's a non-fiction, and the other is fiction about a different wartime. It's a historical fiction. So two very different books. One which is set now in non-fiction, one which is fiction set more than 100 years ago. So tell us how those two very different books came into existence at the same moment.
Well, I mean, since my books are translated, it means actually it takes time before they are translated. And the Silverborn, the first book in the series about Kyiv of 1919, was written in 2018. And I wrote the second novel, the sequel, in 2020. And I was writing the third one when the full-scale invasion started. And then I couldn't write fiction for more than 2 years. I tried, I failed, and only now actually I managed to get back to writing at the same time fiction, and it's historical crime fiction, but based on the real events and where I use a lot of archives, especially to describe the real daily life in Kyiv. This is the second occupation of Kyiv by Bolsheviks, which started on the 6th of February 1919 and ended on the 31st of July. And there are so many parallels because actually the war, I mean, if you know the history, and I'm sure you know, that 1918, 1921 was always taught in the Soviet schools as the civil war after the October Revolution of 1917. Well, it was civil war on the Russian territory, Bolsheviks against White Army. In Ukraine, we had 7 armies fighting each other, and it was again 2 wars for the price of one. It was war for Ukrainian independence and war between the Bolsheviks and the White Army. And this was never taught until 30 years ago. And it is incredible because Kyiv changed hands 13 times. It was controlled by Bolsheviks 4 times. The last moment, which is for me, I want to write about this period also, is 1920, 1921, when Kyiv was taken over by Polish army. I mean, there is not a single book about this. But what is important that the parallels I mentioned, Kyiv was attacked in February 2022 from the same northeastern side as Kyiv was attacked in 1918 by the Red Army of General Muravyov. And in October 2022, the same streets and almost the same buildings were shelled as they were shelled in 1918 by Muravyov's Red Army. So, I mean, and in 1918-21, this war was the war of the Red Army to take over all of Ukraine and to transform it into the Soviet Republic. And the idea of Putin this time was the same. He wanted actually to take all of Ukraine and make it another province of Russian Empire. It failed. And actually, one more historical thing, which has nothing to do with my book, but I mean, it's very important to understand that 10 years ago, Putin was mentioning Ivan the Terrible as his favorite Tsar. You understand why. But suddenly, before the full-scale invasion, he started talking about Peter the Great as the most important Russian Tsar. And first I couldn't understand why, because I mean, Peter the Great was, one can say, pro-European. He went to Amsterdam to learn how to build ships. He invited German doctors to St. Petersburg, etc. But actually not because of this he is so much loved by Putin, but because after Poltava battle, which was the battle between Russian army and Hetman Mazepa's army and Swedish King's army. And you know that Mazepa was defeated and found refuge in Bessarabia. After this, Ukraine practically, it is 1709, was all under control of Russian Empire. And then 11 years later, Peter the Great signed the first law, the first decree banning publication of Ukrainian religious texts and ordering to remove all religious texts already existing from Ukrainian churches. This is the beginning actually of the war against Ukrainian national identity, which is going on until today and will go on until we sort out our relationship with Russia and Russia returns to its territories and will never come again.
Yes, so many resonant resonant, kind of historical resonances, historical parallels with 1918, 1919, or with, you know, Mazepa, Poltava. I wonder, as a writer who thinks about history, are there some kind of lessons we can learn that would be useful for today from this kind of history of, in the end, defeats?
Well, I mean, I'm a pathological optimist, and I believe in mankind, and I believe that it is possible to learn lessons from history. Well, I don't believe in the latter ones. I mean, I see that actually the mistakes are repeated, and people do forget. I mean, people forget how fascist regime can be established. We saw it. And so, I mean, you shouldn't rely on the history. You should just control the political situation around you every moment. And so also Europe shouldn't rely on the declaration of democracy, because, I mean, a fascist regime can just pop up anywhere, from Hungary to other corners of Europe. And the ordinary citizens just will not notice it until the foreign agent law is signed in Bulgaria by the president of Bulgaria or by Orban. And then the same thing will happen to these countries as it happened to Russia.
So I asked you about the time period for the book, The Silverborn, but I'm also interested in not only the time, but also the place, because this is a book about Kyiv. Yeah. It's not your first book set in Kyiv. It's and you are from Kyiv, or lived in Kyiv for a very long time. It seems like you have I always feel like Kyiv in your books is a character. It's not just a place where things happen, it's kind of a character. It has its own personality. It seems to somehow influence the characters, influence the plot in some ways. If you get The Silverborn, which I hope you do, there's a nice map in the inside cover where you can see where everything is happening. And I want to ask you about Kyiv, about writing about Kyiv.
Well, I had a dream probably from the end of 1980s, to return Kyiv to the map of the literary cities of the world. That's why actually I wrote so many novels set in Kyiv. And I mean, writing about Kyiv in 1919, it was actually a huge discovery for me, because I have several maps of 1913, 1918, 1919. I have German maps of German army of Kyiv. And from time to time, actually, I take one map and I walk according to this map, checking which buildings are still there, and try to find out who was living there, what happened there. And it's, I mean, Kyiv still, for me, is a miracle, and lots of things to discover. And in the sequel to The Silverborn, The Stolen Heart, which is coming out in February, there will be a lot about so-called Soviet Railway Republic. So, I mean, you probably don't know, but it was illegal in 1919 without special pass to cross railways in the area of railway station. You had to have a document. I have actually original documents for the people who were allowed to cross. And because the railway people, I mean, they were privileged and special, and the ordinary Red Army people were afraid of the railway people, because, I mean, they depended on the railway. But one more thing, just to mention that there were thousands of Chinese Red Army soldiers in Kyiv at that time. At least half of them came from Petersburg area and north from Petersburg, because in 1913 China signed a contract with the Russian Empire to build railway from Petersburg to Murmansk, but it was not Murmansk, another city, yeah. And thousands of Chinese railway builders were sent there, and then the First World War started, and they were abandoned. And those who survived, they came first to St. Petersburg, and much later they realized that if they don't want to die of hunger, they should join Red Army, and they will get clothes and they will get food. And so, I mean, these soldiers came to Kyiv, and they were not afraid of railway people, railway soldiers or railway runners in Kyiv. So, I mean, VCK used Chinese detachment, in fact, to frighten people off and to do what they wanted to do.
Yeah, and they appear in the book. I know it's quite noticeable. They appear here and there, those Chinese soldiers. Speaking about literary Kyiv, maybe obviously we can start with your books, but are there any other recommendations that you have for Ukrainian literature about Kyiv that we could use to recreate?
I think there is an English translation of the novel Misto.
There is, yeah.
The city. Yeah, it was just published, and I think it should be very interesting to see Kyiv from the very Ukrainian perspective, because actually, you know, that Kyiv was divided into not districts, but the areas where different groups of population lived. And the old central part was inhabited mostly by Russian-speaking aristocracy, and partially, but not to great extent, by Ukrainian-speaking aristocracy, architects, lawyers, professors, etc. The other districts, I mean, like Podil was always a craftsman and trade Jewish district, and Kurinyovka was like a village. It was actually populated by the peasants and by the horse drivers, by kuchers. And so everybody knows The White Guard by Bulgakov, the novel which is written with perspective of a person who belonged to Russian-speaking aristocracy. The novel The City actually is very opposite.
So, a recommendation, so that's Misto, the City, by Kyiv Mysteries, translated by Maxim Tarnavsky, you can find that. I could ask you lots more questions about Kyiv, but I think maybe this is a good moment to open the floor to questions. So if anyone has a question for Andriy, please put your hand up. And just when you ask a question, I will repeat the question to the microphone just for the recording. Yeah. The question is about Death and the Penguin, the first kind of famous novel, certainly in English, the novel that made your name, and how you relate to that today, and do you feel like maybe it's defined you as a writer?
Well, in fact, actually, when Death and the Penguin became a hit, I was a bit upset because I was hoping that another novel of mine will be well read and will be noticed. The Bigford's Fuse. I don't know if there is this novel here.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
But of course, I mean, Bigford's Fuse is very complicated, and it has a rat instead of a penguin, and rats are not very sexy. Although, I mean, this rat is very special. And of course, I mean, everybody loves penguins. And this was the book which I wrote in 1995, about 1992-93 in Kyiv, which was a very difficult time, very dark time, because actually people were afraid to go outside in the darkness. There were different mafia groups fighting each other. So I mean, I remember that when I earned my first $100, I put a bulletproof door on the apartment. We still have it. Yeah, I mean, it was exotic, of course, for the world. It was not exotic for Ukraine. This is also another issue. But I accepted it. I accepted that actually I became associated mostly with this book. And then German readers were suddenly attacking me for being cruel to animals because of the end of this novel, because of what was happening to Penguin Misha. So in 2002, I had to write a sequel for the sake of happy end. And then somebody asked me if I'm going to write the third one. I said, who needs a novel after happy end? Who needs a sequel? So thanks God I didn't. But I was yesterday at the Times radio, and the presenter mentioned before the broadcast that he will mention Death and the Penguin. I told him no, please. I mean, my latest book is Our Daily War, about life during the war in Ukraine. And the previous book, which is very important to me, is Grey Bees, about the grey zone of Ukraine. And he mentioned Our Daily War. I was very grateful to him, and actually even asked some questions about this novel. Yeah.
So the question is about whether you're optimistic about the future sovereignty of Ukraine after Putin is gone, given the Russians' tendency to forget their own history.
Well, I'm sure that Ukraine will keep the sovereignty and will be a proper member of European Union, and but Ukraine will remember what happened, and Russia will try to forget, as we know, as they forgot Gulag and made Stalin hero again. So I mean, the issue will remain, and Ukraine will have to be always on alert regarding the neighbor on the eastern side.
So the question was, what influences the mysterious nature of your writing?
Well, I mean, I have a personal moment of becoming very interested in history. In 1980, my grandfather died, and only after his death I found out that he had two brothers, and both were imprisoned and sent to Gulag in 1930s. Both survived. One actually settled in Irkutsk, and once actually a nephew of this family found us in Kyiv. But when I found out about this, I realized that actually the history that we were taught in the school was complete rubbish. And I started going around Soviet Union. I hitchhiked, I water hiked, and I was looking for old people who occupied important positions in the past, so-called honorary retired people. And I was trying to interview them. And I was practically lying to them. I had been studying foreign languages, but I was telling them that I'm a journalist student and I want to interview them about the past. And then I realized actually that those retired people who were upset by Khrushchev, who were removed by Khrushchev because they were representatives of Stalin's regime, they were happy to talk about the past. Those who survived happily to their retirement, they were telling me the same fairy tales that were written in the school manuals. And so I think these several years of traveling, I mean, it resulted in the Bigfoot's Views, it resulted in trilogy, which is not yet translated into English, The Geography of a Single Gunshot. It taught me how to treat history, and taught me how to dig deep and how to find the information. And then I discovered that you can actually work with archives, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeah.
You actually have an interesting story about the Silverborn and the archives.
Yeah, in 2017, when I finished Grey Bees, I got a phone call from one lady who was my reader, and she said, I have a present for you, can you give me your address? So I gave my address in Kyiv, and she came with a car and with a box of authentic VCK documents from 1919 until 1927, and they, I mean, she was daughter of KGB major. He recently died, who worked after the collapse of the Soviet Union in Ukrainian Secret Service, and he got it somewhere in the Soviet time, and he wanted to write non-fiction because on some documents I have his remarks and sort of questions, and something is underlined. But anyway, I read these papers. And I was immediately, again, fascinated by the period of 1918, 1921. And first I thought that I will just write historical novel. But I gave it a second thought, and I decided that actually historical novels, I usually, yes, they give lots of details, but they attract less attention. So I decided to write a fusion novel, a historical crime novel with a real daily life in Kyiv at that time on the background. And that's what I'm doing now, actually. And I'm very happy that I'm back to writing the third novel.
Are there things that we can understand better about the past through fiction than through reading history, through fiction like yours? What's the advantage of fiction?
Well, I mean, in the last years I became a huge fan of non-fiction. So for me, I think we should read both with the same attention, with the same passion. The fiction is very important when it is written about the times in which the author lives. So it becomes non-fiction later, because actually the details are gone. I mean, like the price of box of matches, you know, it was 1 kopeck in 1971. So, I mean, it's not important, but I mean, from this kind of small things, the whole picture is reassembled when you read fiction. When you read books about 1960s, written in 1960s by the authors who were free, who were not censored. So, I mean, you get double pleasure. You have a pleasure from the story, and then actually you learn about the time when this book was written, or the time this book describes.
Yeah, there are lots of those details in the Silverborn as well, like what people were eating,
Well,
what they're wearing, all these. You must have done lots of research into those
yeah, I wish I could use all the details that I know, because they are so incredible. But the easiest to consume examples are that, for example, when every time Bolsheviks would come, they would introduce new rules and new laws and new instructions. And one of the rules of 1919, they introduced furniture tax. So they shared in Kyiv, and every family had to have this list of furniture which they are allowed to have in the apartment, and the rest they should give to the Soviet authorities. So every family had a right to have as many chairs as there were members in the family, plus one chair for guests. You couldn't have 2 desks. You couldn't have 3 armchairs. So everything which was extra was taken away by the Red Army on the horse-driven carts to the Soviet offices, because they wanted to have offices. They are the government power, and the offices were empty because everything was broken, burned down, stolen. So you can imagine coming to a Soviet office in 1919 in Kyiv and seeing a desk from royal family, a stool from peasant's house, one armchair from house of an aristocrat, and then suddenly a mirror in a golden frame on the wall. So it was surreal, but it was surreal time. Another thing they did, they introduced underwear tax. So every family had to give 2 or 3 pairs of underwear to the Soviet authorities, because the Red Army soldiers didn't have enough underwear. Of course, one law which was signed by Lenin in Moscow, it's just, I don't know how to fit it, where to fit it. You should help me, because Nabatny Dzvin, how to translate? It's the ringing the bells, not in the church service order, but to attract attention. It's called Nabatny Dzvin, and it was specially banned by the Red government, because they were afraid that with this ringing, peasants in the countryside or priests in the countryside will organize rebels against the Soviet authorities.
The question was about grey bees. It's just basically about what you wanted to achieve writing grey bees. Yeah.
Well, in 2017, by 2017, I went 3 times to the war zone. In 2015, together with Mariana Sadovskaya, who is a singer, excellent singer from Germany, and Serhiy Zhadan, we went practically along the front line to the Russian border in Severodonetsk. And we met lots of people, and we had talks and meetings with soldiers and with local population. And then I went 2 times more. And by that time, there were about 200 books written about war in Donbass. But they were all written by volunteers, soldiers, veterans, and they were all about fighting, all about enemies and heroes. So there was not a single book about life of civil population which decided to remain in the fighting zone. And actually, somehow I thought it is strange somebody should give voice to ordinary people who remained or got stuck in the war without taking part in it. And then actually I met people who lived in the gray zone and then left it, decided to get evacuated. I knew that actually there were dozens of the villages almost dead, but there were some people still living with no electricity, no gas, no shops, no post, no authorities, no police. Then I found out about a young lady in Kharkiv who decided to publish a newspaper for the gray zone in Ukraine. And it was a newspaper without politics. These were the articles about pensions, the changes in the pension fund and things like this, advice on the health, etc. And she was giving it to the volunteers, Ukrainian volunteers, who were coming to these villages, bringing people food and medicine and things like this. And this was actually the starting point for this novel. Because I mean it's about, and of course I mean nobody realized at that time that the gray zone was the same length as the front line, 430 kilometers, and it included also a part of Avdiivka, industrial part of Avdiivka officially was in the gray zone. So I mean this is the book practically about people who couldn't decide what to do and had to choose between two fears. Fear to be killed at home and fear to go nobody knows where as a refugee without understanding who will help you and where you will end up. And so most of these aged people, I mean they decided, they were thinking, no, I will better stay here. At least if I'm killed together with my life, together with my house, I'm destroyed. And then actually when I started writing, I thought that this is a chance to show three different Ukraines, not only gray zone. And it is a book about annexed Crimea, free Ukraine, actually the area which is not free anymore, district Vesely, Zaporizhia region, and the gray zone, and also the Donetsk People's Republic briefly, when the main character starts traveling with his bees through Donetsk Republic into Ukrainian territory.
Oh, I see lots of hands going up now. So the question is, how would we define a Soviet author and whether we had successful Ukrainian Soviet authors, and also maybe about literature as resistance as well?
Well, I mean, Ukrainians were, especially Ukrainian authors in the Soviet time, sometimes were very foxy, and they managed to write not exactly Soviet books, and at the same time to make a career. And the first person like this is Pavlo Zagrebelny, who was actually a party member, head of the Writers' Union, and never wrote ideologically correct book because he found a refuge in historical literature. In 1980s, in the end, during Perestroika, he wrote the first critical novel about the prosecutor's office. And in spite of the fact that it was already Gorbachev's time, Ukrainian authorities got afraid of this novel, and he managed to pass it on to Moscow, and it was published in Russian first in Moscow and then was published in Ukrainian. So, I mean, there were several authors from the Soviet Ukrainian literature period which survived. But Zagrebelny will definitely survive. Of course, I mean, his competitor, Mikhailo Stelmach, he was a proper Soviet author who was writing proper Soviet literature. But Ukrainian critics found some signs in his books that he actually was not really Soviet. He's not read anymore, but his name is known, yes. But generally, in 1980s, there were 5,000 members of the Ukrainian Writers' Union. And of course, total majority had been writing rubbish, and they are forgotten, which is good for post-Soviet Ukrainian literature and its history.
Okay, so the first part of the question was, is the grey zone not just a place, but also a kind of space of identity between the Soviet past and the present, where there are kind of ambivalent, ambiguous identities, and also about the ending of Grey Bees, and whether there was an alternative ending that you had in mind.
No, I mean, it's the character in the end has a choice of going either to his ex-wife in Vinnytsia or to the lady in Zaporizhia region who likes him and who looked after him when he was there. So it's not me who had a choice. And I wrote what I decided to write. Regarding Grey Zone, yes, I mean, Grey Zone is not only territory. Grey Zone is the result of political indifference or just ignorance, chosen ignorance, how to deal with the reality. So, I mean, when people say that Donetsk or Donbass was pro-Russian. It is not correct, because Donbass was partially pro-Soviet, nostalgic, and this nostalgia was supported by Russia, and that's why people in Donbass loved Russian TV channel Nostalgia, which had been broadcasting and still broadcast in black and white sometimes comedy shows from the Soviet times and Soviet films. But yes, I mean, there is a play based on the first part of the Grey Bee, running in Kyiv in theater on Podil, where there is a bit more speculations or talks about gray zone as not something physical, but something inside a head. So you are right in this sense, yes.
Okay, so your favorite British writers and your attitude towards Russian writers, and let's take your question, if it's okay. Are the books based on real life people, real life prototypes?
Yes.
Okay, or not. Okay, so the last one. Will the Silverborn and the Kyiv Mysteries become a Netflix series, which they definitely should?
Well, probably they couldn't find me because I'm traveling a lot, but they will find me, yes, I believe, yes. My favorite British authors are now Philip Sands and Mark Forsyth, both non-fiction authors, but I like also Nick Hornby and some others, of course, yeah.
Philip Sands, also a patron of the Ukrainian Institute London, I should say.
Yeah. I don't read already for a long time Russian literature. Until the war, I was following Vladimir Sorokin. We are still friends with him, but generally I don't feel like psychologically, emotionally, like reading anything at all now from Russian literature. There was another question?
Real life characters. Are your characters based on real life?
Well, I mean, in Bigfoot's views, one of the characters is based on Nikita Khrushchev. But it is a fantasy because he is all the time in the Zeppelin flying over Soviet Union. And I have some of my friends under their real names in some of the novels, like Jimi Hendrix Live in Lemberg. All three characters are real under their real names. Ali Kolisevich, the leader of the hippie movement in Lviv from 1970s. Yurko Vinichuk, great Ukrainian writer and my friend. And Oksana Prokhorets, a volunteer who helps homeless in Lviv. So they are real characters, and they are real in the book like they are in real life, yes. But there are also three invented characters. And sometimes I plant my friends under their own names in other novels, but I don't give them too much to do because yes, I don't want to be cruel.
Okay, I think we have to wrap up there. So before we move on to the next part of our celebration, let's just thank Andriy Kurkov once more for the great conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, William. Thank you. Whoa.